Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today, my guest is Andy Rothman, investment strategist at Matthews Asia. And today we want to discuss recent developments in China and the implications of the Ukraine-Russia conflict on the Chinese economy. Welcome, Andy.
Great to be here. Thank you, Thomas.
Andy, we have seen an incredible roller coaster ride of Chinese technology stocks over the last few days. So what does it tell us about the current state of financial markets?
Everything's in upheaval right now, but I think the primary factors that have worried people about China have been domestic. There's been some confusion about where the Chinese government is going in terms of its economic policy and its regulatory policy. But I'm actually quite optimistic about this year because at a time when the United States and large parts of the rest of the world are going to be tightening, we're already seeing the beginnings of a significant easing cycle in China. We're seeing easing of monetary policy, a lot more availability of credit, the Chinese central bank cutting rates while the Fed is talking about raising rates. And we're also seeing easier fiscal policy. We're going to see a greatly expanded government spending this year. And maybe most importantly for investors, it looks like we're going to have a much more stable, less difficult regulatory environment in China this year.
US President Biden and China's Xi Jinping spoke on Friday about things going on in the Ukraine, for example. So what does the outcome mean for the future of this crisis and the West's relationship with China?
Well, obviously, what's happening in Ukraine is a terrible tragedy, and my heart goes out to everybody that's affected by that across Europe, especially in Ukraine. And it's really disappointing, the position that the Chinese government has taken, not using its somewhat limited leverage, maybe with Russia to the fullest extent it could. But I also think that in terms of the impact on the Chinese economy, it's going to be relatively small. China's trade with Russia is not that significant. As with much of the rest of the world, it's focused on energy and commodities, but the impact of, let's say, higher oil prices on Chinese consumers will be much less than the impact on consumers elsewhere in the world. Let me give you an example, Thomas. Oil prices have been going up for some time, and we've seen significantly elevated inflation. Last year in the United States, for example, CPI over 4% last year, this year over 7%. But in China, while oil prices globally have gone up, the pass-through to Chinese consumers has been much less. And consumer price inflation, CPI, has still been only around 2% because of mechanisms that the Chinese government has in place to limit the pass-through. So I think the economic impact will be much less significant in China than much of the rest of the world.
So let's go back to geopolitics for a moment. So investors are scared off by Xi Jinping's no limits partnership pledge with Russia. So do we need to rethink political risks related to China?
I think despite having said there are no limits, there are limits. My view is that the Chinese government is not going to cross the line of providing military assistance to Putin or cross the line in terms of violating sanctions that are in place on Russia put there by the EU and the United States. And I think, the reasons for that are clear. That would result in significant secondary sanctions from the United States on the Chinese economy. And that, I think, is not a line that Xi Jinping is going to cross. At the same time, though, we do have to recognize that US-China political relationships have been very tense for the last few years. And the Chinese government's position on Ukraine is likely to prevent that from getting any better. So we're going to have competing weather patterns in China for investors this year. The one weather pattern is the one I described before, that economics are going to look pretty increasingly good, especially compared to much of the rest of the world that's going to be tightening. But the other side is these political headwinds, the tension between Beijing and Washington and Brussels are going to remain there. And that's something that investors are going to need to pay attention to.
Yeah, the big elephant in the room is still the pandemic. And China's restrictive COVID-19 policy is becoming a threat to the global economy and especially supply chains. What are the implications of the recent lockdowns for Chinese companies?
Yeah, I think that there is always a risk that China's so-called zero COVID policy becomes a threat to global economy and global supply chains. But the evidence so far is that it has not been a risk, that China has, I think, been holding up its end of the global supply chains despite having very tough policies to deal with COVID. Effectively, the Chinese government has been saying that they're putting more weight on public health and safety rather than on economics. But at the same time, last year, economic growth in China was among the fastest in the world. And we could see that in the data we have through the third quarter of last year, China's share of global exports actually hit an all-time high. So I would argue that there's no evidence yet that China's pursuit of its COVID control programs has had a significant negative impact. More recently, we've seen lockdowns uh, in a number of cities, but they haven't generally not been citywide. They've been either housing block by housing block or neighborhood by neighborhood. Just this morning, before we started our interview, we heard that Foxconn, which is a major supplier for companies like Apple, has been able to reopen its facilities in southern China, which are not the main facilities, but important because they've been working with the government on finding a way to manage the balance between COVID and continuing to operate. So I think that we need to keep an eye on this, but it's too soon to reach the conclusion that this is going to have a negative impact on the global economy or on supply chains.
Supply chain and technology are good keywords. So China is focusing on technological self-sufficiency and domestic consumption. Will this be enough to reach the self-set 5.5% growth target in 2022?
Yeah, well, Thomas, I have been trying to persuade investors for probably 2 decades now to not pay too much attention to the GDP growth rate or the GDP targets. I would argue the GDP growth rate in China is both the least accurate economic statistic and also, from an investor's perspective, the least important. Whether GDP growth is 5 or 6 this year really isn't going to change the way I think about the health of the Chinese economy or investing there. I would argue that the longer term trends that the Chinese government are talking about, things like technological self-sufficiency, moving more towards a consumer-based, domestic demand-driven economy, those have been underway for a long time and are in fact a good way to think about investing in China. For example, not a lot of people know that China is no longer an export-driven economy. It's no longer a manufacturing-driven economy. Last year was the 10th consecutive year in which the tertiary part of China's GDP, that's the services and consumption part, was the biggest part of GDP. And it accounts for most of the growth. So when my colleagues on the Matthews Asia investment team, who run our strategies and pick the stocks, look at Chinese companies on behalf of our clients, what we're really focused on is Chinese companies selling goods and services to Chinese consumers. It's the biggest and fastest growing part of the economy. And that's still the case despite the COVID issues in China.
A regulatory wave and real estate crisis in the last year. So China's stock market disappointed investors in 2021. So what is the case for investing in Chinese equities in 2022?
Yeah, no doubt last year was a disappointing year for equity investors in China. And I think that you touched on the two key issues, technology and real estate. Technology in terms of government oversight. But I think it's important to put this oversight and last year's regulatory crackdown into context. What was the Chinese government trying to do? I read some people arguing that what they were trying to do is roll back the market-based reforms that had led to all of the economic growth in the last couple of decades in China. I've read some people argue that the Chinese government is trying to shut down or silence or reduce the role of larger privately owned entrepreneurial companies, or that they're against people getting rich in China. And I think all of that analysis is off the mark. I do not think that's what the Chinese government's doing. Look at it this way. The Chinese people have gotten rich and their standards of living have improved dramatically. They've seen a corresponding improvement in personal freedom. And the Chinese government has stayed in power in a stable way for the last couple of decades because of the market-based reforms and the rise of small entrepreneurial private companies, the kinds of companies we like to invest in. These private companies are the companies that generate all the new jobs in China, account for the vast majority of employment in China, create all the innovation and all the wealth. So it doesn't make sense that the government would want to handicap those companies. Instead, I think what's going on is the Chinese government's worried about the same kinds of socioeconomic issues that we're worried about in our countries. Income inequality, inequality of wealth, unequal access to healthcare and education. And then also on the business side, are large companies, particularly in the internet platform space, using anti-competitive practices to restrain their competitors. And the Chinese government has moved much more rapidly than our governments have to try and deal with those. And as a result, they've made a lot of mistakes. And that really was, I think, the main reason why a lot of the technology companies fared really poorly in the market last year. But the Chinese government, while they implemented these things poorly, didn't explain it well. In the last few months, they've also come out at a senior level and said, yeah, we recognize we didn't do this well. And they have promised to handle this better this year. And I think it's good that they've recognized that they overdid it and that they're talking now at senior levels about a more stable implementation of these admirable goals that deal with socioeconomic problems. So I think the regulatory environment is going to be much more transparent and stable this year. You mentioned property. I would not use the term crisis in the property market in China. For me, it's one of the healthiest parts of the Chinese economy, in large part because I think the Chinese regulators learned a lot from the experience in the United States. So, Thomas, I tell people, if you want to understand why the US had a housing crisis about a decade ago, you only need to know one statistic. And that's that in the year before the housing crisis, in 2006, the median cash down payment for a new home in the United States, the median was 2% of the purchase price. Add to that all sorts of creative financing, no interest, no doc loans, those kinds of things, heavy mortgage securitization. The Chinese government learned from that. And by regulation, the minimum cash down payment in China for a new home, if you're going to live in it, is 20%. And I've yet to speak to a bank in China that will give you a mortgage for less than 25% cash down. And on top of that, the banks keep almost all mortgages to maturity. So they have a big incentive to do due diligence. So I think the market's actually healthy. But again, the regulators overdid it last year. They shut down the market in the second half of last year, trying to force consolidation, worried about some overly risky developers. But I think they realized they overdid it. They're now encouraging banks to make mortgages again. So I think by the second half of this year, we're going to see the residential property market in China go back to normal.
This was Andy Rothman from Matthews Asia. Thank you very much, Andy, for sharing your insights and being with us today.
Thanks for the opportunity to be with you today. Appreciate it.